Inside a crowded courtroom, arrogance collides with quiet dignity. Two officers humiliate a black woman in front of everyone, their hands heavy with power. Yet she does not flinch. With one calm line, she plants the seed of a twist that will shake the entire room. We don't respect people like you. Sit down and know your place. The words cracked through the air like a whip, pulling every gaze in the courtroom toward the front. The oak benches creaked as people shifted uneasily, some leaning forward, others sinking back, afraid of what might happen next. The air smelled of paper and dust, but beneath it all was the thick, electric scent of tension. Two uniformed officers stood on either side of the wooden aisle, their boots polished, their badges gleaming as though the shine itself gave them authority. Their faces were sharp with disdain. They were not whispering, not hiding. This humiliation was meant to be heard. The room's silence became complicit. A heavy cloak draped over the watching crowd. At the center of it all sat a woman. Dark skin, calm eyes, dressed not in wealth or armor, but in quiet confidence. She did not fidget. She did not bow her head. Her posture was upright, her gaze fixed not on the men who insulted her, but on something beyond them, as though their cruelty could not pierce the walls of her dignity. Taller officer leaned down, his shadow stretching across her like a dark stain. He smirked. "Answer me when I talk to you." Still, she said nothing. The courtroom audience whispered, the buzz of discomfort rising and falling. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "This is wrong," but too softly for it to matter. The silence angered him. He lifted his hand, and before the crowd could even gasp, the crack of his palm striking her cheek echoed across the chamber. The sound bounced against marble columns, rattled wooden benches, froze breath in mid-air. The woman's head tilted slightly from the force, but she did not fall, did not stumble. Her eyes closed for a moment, then reopened steady, unbroken. A faint red mark bloomed on her skin like fire, but she breathed evenly, her composure untouched. The second officer laughed under his breath. "That's better." Maybe now she'll remember where she stands. Her fingers moved. Not to strike back, not to shield herself, but to smooth the edge of her sleeve, one small symbolic action, elegant and deliberate, as if she were brushing away dust. The crowd saw it. Some frowned in shame. Others looked down, unable to meet her gaze. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, calm, but it cut through the courtroom like steel. "You think I'm here to stand before you," she said, her tone as precise as a blade. "But one day you will stand before me." A hush descended so deep it seemed the walls themselves were listening. The officers blinked, caught off guard by the confidence in her words. They looked at each other, uneasy laughter failing to mask the tremor in their pride. The judge, seated high above, banged his gavel once not for justice, but for control. "Order!" He barked, though the true chaos was not in the crowd, but in the shifting power that had just begun to crack the floor beneath his courtroom. The woman did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply sat there, eyes steady, her calmness now a storm on the horizon. And in that silence, something stirred, a ripple of recognition, a flicker of unease in the eyes of those who had mocked her only moments ago. Because though they had struck her, though they had tried to strip her dignity, she had left them with a sentence heavier than any gavel, and somewhere, hidden behind the weight of marble pillars and stained wooden walls, the truth waited ready to reveal who she truly was. The crowd didn't know it yet. Neither did the officers. But the courtroom had just witnessed the beginning of its own undoing. The sting of the slap had faded, but the silence it left behind clung to every wall, every breath in the courtroom. The sound had been so sharp, so final, that even the wooden benches seemed to remember it. People shifted uneasily, whispering to their neighbors, their words heavy with fear and judgment. "She shouldn't have been so defiant," muttered a man in a gray suit, his lips curled with disdain. "No," "This isn't right," a woman in the back row hissed. They struck her like she was nothing. The whispers grew, crisscrossing through the chamber like sparks threatening to ignite. Some spoke in defense of the officers, others in shame of what they had witnessed. The divide was clear, etched in the glances exchanged between strangers. The officers, emboldened by their own arrogance, stood taller. Their smirks carried the confidence of men who believed their uniforms made them untouchable. Yet behind that confidence flickered something small and unease, a tiny ripple born from the words the woman had spoken. "You will stand before me," they replayed in their minds, a haunting echo that gnawed at the corners of their pride. The judge cleared his throat, tapping the gavel once. His voice was gravelly, impatient. "Order in the court. We will not tolerate disruptions." But the disruption was already alive, pulsing through every glance, every breath. The woman had not moved. She remained seated, her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her cheek bore the faint red mark, a reminder of violence, but her eyes held no fear, only the quiet certainty of someone who carried truth like armor. The bailiff stepped closer, uncertain. His eyes lingered on her as if asking silently, "Why aren't you afraid? Why do you still look stronger than them?" On the left side of the courtroom, a young man whispered harshly, "This is the kind of thing that gets swept under the rug. Nobody will ever hear of it," but the woman's calmness made it impossible to ignore. The very silence around her had become an indictment, louder than any protest could be. The taller officer leaned forward again, trying to smother his growing discomfort with mockery. "What are you smiling at?" He sneered, though her lips had not moved. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that unsettled him more than any outburst could have. Her voice came low, almost a whisper, yet it filled the chamber. "You mistake silence for weakness," she said. "But silence carries memory, and memory carries judgment." The words struck like a hidden hammer, reverberating through the crowd. Some gasped softly. Others leaned in, compelled despite themselves. The officer scoffed, though the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Big words for someone sitting in chains of the system. For the first time, her lips curved not into a smile of surrender, but into something sharper, quieter. "Chains break," she replied. The audience murmured again, louder now, the tension no longer containable. The judge slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack, his face hard with irritation. "Enough! This courtroom is not a theater. Sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed." But even his voice carried a threat of unease, because though he sat higher, above them all, he felt the weight of her words pressing upward, threatening to pierce the bench itself. The slap had been meant to silence her. Instead, it had awakened something no one could ignore. And somewhere in the gallery, a quiet observer, an older woman in a navy dress, watched with sharp eyes. She did not speak, but she leaned forward ever so slightly, as though she recognized something the rest had missed. The officers stood rigid, their authority suddenly fragile. The woman sat calm, her presence unshaken. And the courtroom itself seemed to tremble, as though the walls were beginning to realize they no longer belonged to those who thought they owned them. The trial had not yet begun, but already judgment had entered the room. The gavel struck again. "Order!" The judge barked, his voice sharp as the echo bounced through the high ceiling. Yet the command rang hollow. The sound of authority was losing its weight. People in the gallery shifted uneasily. Some pressed their lips together, afraid to speak aloud, but their eyes betrayed them. They had seen too much. They had heard words that refused to leave their minds. The woman still sat upright, her presence unbent. She hadn't moved since the slap. It was as if time itself had anchored her there, unshaken, undeniable. The taller officer tugged at his collar. Sweat had begun to bead at his temple, though the courtroom air was cool. His partner leaned closer to him, whispering low, "You shouldn't have done that." "Not here, not in front of everyone," the taller one sneered. She had to be taught, but his voice carried doubt, like a man trying to convince himself more than his partner. A cough rose from the back, followed by a man muttering, "Shameful. Absolutely shameful." The judge slammed the gavel again. "Who said that?" Silence. His irritation betrayed his fear. The courtroom was slipping away from him. One whisper at a time. The woman turned her gaze toward the benches, her eyes scanning the crowd. Her look was not desperate, not pleading, but steady, almost as if she were measuring them. Each person she looked at shifted under the weight of it, as though she was silently asking a question none of them dared to answer, and then her eyes returned to the officers. She didn't need to speak, yet her silence pressed against them harder than chains. The shorter officer cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "She's just trying to scare us," he muttered loudly enough for others to hear. Words don't change where she sits. But his words faltered when the woman finally moved. She leaned forward slightly, placing her palms on the table before her. The motion was slow, deliberate, yet it carried the gravity of a storm approaching. "When truth enters a room," she said softly, "even stone begins to crack." The crowd inhaled as one, a collective shiver running through them. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't escape the pull of her voice. It had weight. It had conviction. The judge's jaw tightened. "This is a trial, not a pulpit. If you continue speaking out of turn, I will hold you in contempt." Her eyes lifted to him now, steady and sharp. "Contempt?" she echoed, her voice low. "I know contempt. I have lived it in uniforms and laws, in eyes that look at me and see less than human. But do you know what else I have lived?" The judge blinked, his gavel frozen in midair. The woman's voice deepened, each word like a stone placed carefully on the table between them. "I have lived justice. And justice does not kneel to uniforms or benches. It sits higher." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded almost instinctively, while others sat stiff, unwilling to be swayed but unable to look away. The taller officer shifted his stance again, his arrogance fraying at the edges. He opened his mouth, but the older woman in the navy dress, still watching silently from the gallery, shifted forward in her seat. Her eyes locked onto the officers, cold and unblinking, as though she knew something they did not. The officer swallowed his words. The courtroom seemed to pulse with something invisible, an undercurrent no one could name. The slap had started it, but it was her words that carried it forward, spreading cracks through the foundation of power itself. The judge slammed the gavel once more, louder, harsher, but this time his voice trembled. "Enough!" The woman leaned back, her composure unshaken. Her cheek still bore the mark, but it looked less like a wound now and more like a scar of defiance. And though no one could explain it yet, the crowd began to sense a truth. This woman was not the defendant they thought she was. She was something else entirely, something that, very soon, would rise. The courtroom was a theater of eyes. Every glance, every flicker of a stare carried weight. Some eyes were sharp with judgment, others heavy with shame, and many lingered on the woman as though she carried a secret they could not name. Taller officer shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. His confidence, once a shield, now felt like paper armor. His partner leaned close, whispering through clenched teeth. "They're looking at us like we're the criminals." "They wouldn't dare," the taller one hissed back. But his words rang hollow. On the bench, the judge adjusted his spectacles, his jaw tight, his gavel resting like a weapon in his hand. He had presided over hundreds of cases, had silenced countless disruptions with nothing more than a raised voice. But this silence that clung to the walls felt different. It was not defiance. It was anticipation. The woman, still seated, turned her head slightly, scanning the gallery once more. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Young men leaned forward, their expressions caught between fear and awe. And in the far corner, the older woman in the navy dress kept her gaze locked, unwavering, as though she already knew how this would end. The protagonist placed her hand on the wooden table, her fingers spread lightly over the grain. She tapped once, twice, a rhythm that was almost imperceptible, yet it drew attention. The small sound was louder than footsteps, louder than breath. It was a reminder. She was still there, unbroken. The shorter officer lost patience. He leaned over her shoulder, his voice dripping venom. "You think these people are with you? They'll forget you the second they walk out that door." She turned her head slowly, her cheeks still marked but her expression calm. Her voice was low but sharp, each syllable deliberate. "They will not forget me," she said. "They will remember you." The words landed heavy. The officer froze, caught in the mirror of his own cruelty. For the first time, his smirk faltered. A ripple of whispers ran through the benches. "She's right. Everyone saw it. They can't erase it now." The judge slammed the gavel, his voice louder than before. "Order! This court will not descend into chaos." But chaos had already crept in. Not loud, not violent, but quiet and undeniable, woven into the stares that no gavel could silence. The protagonist lifted her chin slightly. "Order is not silence," she said. Her words weren't shouted, yet they struck like thunder. "Order is justice." "And justice does not answer to fear," gasps echoed. Even those who disagreed with her felt the tremor of truth in her voice. The taller officer stepped forward, desperate to reclaim authority. "You don't get to redefine this court. You're just—" He stopped mid-sentence, his breath caught. Because in that moment, the woman's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, something shifted in her presence. Not just defiance, not just composure, but a shadow of command, like someone who had once given orders, not taken them. The gallery felt it too. The whispers died into stunned silence. The air thickened, as if the very walls leaned closer to listen. The judge felt it most of all. His hand tightened on the gavel, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words, and then, softly, the woman said, "You mistake me for someone pleading before your mercy. But you will soon learn I do not ask. I rule." The sentence settled like dust after an earthquake, heavy and unavoidable. People exchanged stunned looks. Some doubted, some believed, but none could ignore it. The older woman in the navy dress smiled faintly, the only expression of recognition in the entire room. She knew. The officers bristled, the judge sat frozen, and the crowd held its breath. The truth was not yet spoken, but it hung in the air, undeniable. The woman was not who they thought she was, and soon the courtroom would find out exactly why. The courtroom air was suffocating now, thick with something no one dared name. The slap had been a spark. Her words had been flame. And now the fire was spreading slow, invisible, unstoppable. The judge leaned back in his seat, his fingers tightening around the gavel. His eyes darted to the officers, then back to the woman, as though silently pleading for control he could no longer command. The taller officer broke the silence first. "You think you're clever, don't you?" His voice was harsher now, stripped of mockery, edged with unease. "All these big words, like you're somebody." The woman turned her gaze to him, calm, steady, a gaze that stripped away his uniform until he looked like nothing more than a man, drowning in borrowed power. "Don't think I am somebody," she replied softly. "I know I am," the shorter officer scoffed, though his laughter was brittle. "And who exactly do you think you are? A queen? A saint?" Her head tilted slightly, her silence more cutting than any insult. She didn't need to answer. The weight of her presence was already answering for her. From the gallery, a murmur rose. "She's not just some woman," a voice whispered. "Look at the way she carries herself. She talks like she's in charge," another added. The judge slammed the gavel again. Silence in the gallery. His voice cracked with desperation this time. Authority, once absolute, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The older woman in the navy dress finally leaned forward, her voice clear enough to carry, "Perhaps you should let her speak." Heads turned sharply. Gasps fluttered through the benches. The judge's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to address this court without permission?" The woman in navy did not flinch. Someone who has been waiting to see this moment. Her gaze never left the protagonist. The taller officer bristled, pointing toward the woman at the table. "This is nonsense. She's nothing. Just another case, another file on the desk." But even as he spoke, his words trembled, betraying the fracture in his confidence. Because every eye in the room was no longer on him. Every eye was on her. The protagonist's voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the finality of a verdict. "You call me nothing because you fear what I am." The words struck deep. The officers froze. The judge blinked hard, as though struck himself. "Enough of this," the judge barked, though his voice had lost its sharpness. He turned to the bailiff. "Remove her from the courtroom, now." The bailiff hesitated. His hand twitched toward her shoulder, but when he looked into her eyes, something in him faltered. He stepped back instead, his throat dry. "Your Honor." His voice cracked. I can't." A ripple ran through the benches. People shifted forward, eyes wide, breath held. The taller officer's face turned red with anger. "She's manipulating everyone. Can't you see it?" But it wasn't manipulation. It was truth, heavy and undeniable. The protagonist leaned forward now, her palms resting on the table. Her eyes fixed on the judge. "You demand silence," she said, her voice steady, "because you know words hold power. But I don't need to raise my voice. My presence alone has already shifted this room. And you know why?" The judge's mouth opened, then closed. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The gavel hung useless in his hand. The gallery was dead silent now. Every breath caught. The woman in navy whispered the words the entire courtroom was too afraid to say aloud. "She doesn't belong at that table. She belongs on that bench." The silence cracked open, the truth spilling out like thunder. The officers froze. The judge sat rigid. The crowd stared, stunned, and for the first time, the courtroom saw the woman not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as something else entirely, something higher. The words from the woman in navy still lingered in the air like smoke after fire. "She doesn't belong at that table. She belongs on that bench." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Some shook their heads violently, unwilling to believe. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to deny the possibilities stirring inside them. The officers stiffened, their hands instinctively resting on their belts, as if reaching for power that uniforms alone could not give. The judge slammed his gavel, but this time the sound fell flat, swallowed by the weight of the moment. "Enough of this nonsense. This is my courtroom, mine." His voice cracked under the strain, desperation gnawing at each word. But his claim did not silence the woman. She rose slowly, the wooden chair scraping back across the floor. The sound echoed like thunder, louder than the gavel, louder than the judge's voice. The entire room seemed to lean forward as she stood. Her cheek still bore the faint red mark from the slap, but it no longer looked like humiliation. It looked like a scar carved into stone, unmovable, eternal. The taller officer snapped, pointing a finger at her. "Sit down. You don't get to stand until we tell you." Her head turned toward him, her eyes narrowing, calm but cutting. "You have already struck me down," she said. "But every time you raise your hand against dignity, you strike yourself harder. The officer faltered, words failing him. His finger trembled in midair, then dropped to his side. The shorter officer tried to laugh, but it came out shaky, hollow. "She's playing you all. This is just theater." But the crowd wasn't laughing. The murmurs grew louder, spreading like a tide. "She stands taller than the judge. She speaks like she belongs there. She's not afraid of them." The judge banged his gavel again, sweat trickling down his temple. "I said order. This is a trial, not a revolution." The woman stepped forward, her heels striking the floor in measured rhythm. Each step echoed through the chamber, resonant and steady, as though she was marking time itself. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, but it filled every corner of the room. "You mistake this for theater. But I am not performing. I am reminding you." "Reminding us of what?" The judge barked, his voice trembling despite himself. "That the bench you sit on," she said, her eyes locked on his, "was never yours to keep. It belongs to justice. And justice is not yours to command," the gallery gasped. The words struck like lightning, tearing through the chamber. The taller officer stepped forward, desperate to reassert power. "You can't talk to him like that. He's the judge." "And what is a judge?" she interrupted smoothly, without truth. "A robe and a chair. Nothing more." Her words silenced him instantly. The robe, the gavel, the bench, all of it seemed smaller now, shrinking beneath the weight of her presence. The judge opened his mouth, but no sound came. He gripped the gavel tightly, his knuckles pale, as though afraid to let it slip from his hand. From the gallery, a voice rose, clear and unwavering. "She speaks the truth." Then another joined. "She does." The murmur swelled, no longer whispers but a tide of recognition. The courtroom was no longer watching a trial. They were witnessing a shift. The woman stopped at the center of the room, her posture unbroken, her voice steady. "You put me in chains of perception. You struck me to remind me of my place. But the truth is," she paused, letting the silence thicken, "you fear that my place is above you." The officers stiffened. The judge's lips trembled. The gallery leaned closer. The woman in navy whispered again, but this time her words carried like prophecy. "She is not here to be judged. She is here to judge." The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict ever spoken in that courtroom. And for the first time, the judge himself looked small. The silence that followed was unbearable. It wasn't peace. It was pressure like a storm about to break. Every breath, every glance, every heartbeat belonged to that single moment. The judge gripped his gavel so tightly his knuckles whitened. He raised it once more, as though the sound alone could restore order. But his voice betrayed him. This court belongs to the law." The woman turned her head, her eyes steady. "And what is law without justice?" she asked softly. The words sliced the air. The taller officer shouted, desperate now. "Law is order. Law is what keeps people like her in their place." Gasps filled the gallery. Some nodded, still chained to old beliefs. Others shook their heads violently, disgust rising in their throats. A man in the second row stood, his voice sharp. "Did you hear yourself? People like her?" His words echoed, a challenge flung into the air. The officer turned red, fumbling for a response, but the damage was done. His arrogance had exposed him, and the crowd had heard. The shorter officer tried to patch it with mockery. "Don't be fooled. She's just playing saint. You saw her sitting there, chained like anyone else." The woman's calm gaze shifted to him. "Chains do not define worth," she said. "They reveal fear. And fear lives in the hands that place them." The gallery stirred. Murmurs spread, louder than before. "She's right. They struck her. And still she stands taller. She speaks more like a judge than the one wearing the robe." The judge slammed the gavel. but the sound cracked like splintered wood. "Enough! This is my courtroom, and I will not allow." His words froze when the woman stepped closer to the bench. Her presence was not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Every step was measured, deliberate, like a verdict unfolding one sentence at a time. She stopped at the foot of the bench and looked up. The robe, the gavel, the seat of power, it all seemed smaller when compared to her steady gaze. "You hold the gavel," she said calmly, "but you cannot hold truth. And truth is heavier than any hammer." The judge's hand trembled. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of eyes not on the defendant but on him. Eyes that judged him. The taller officer growled, "Don't listen to her. She's twisting everything." But the gallery had already shifted. A young woman in the back row rose to her feet. "No," she said firmly. "She's speaking what we've all been too afraid to say." Another stood. Then another. One by one, people rose, not in chaos, but in quiet recognition. The sight rattled the officers, their uniforms suddenly flimsy against the tide of awakening. The judge's voice broke. "Sit down, all of you." But they didn't. The protagonist lifted her chin, her voice low yet thunderous. "You see them standing, not because I told them to, but because truth demands it. Truth rises when lies collapse." Her words rolled through the chamber, echoing in every corner. The judge sank back into his seat, his gavel heavy in his hand, his authority slipping away. The officers looked to him for guidance, but found only silence. The woman in navy smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the protagonist. She whispered, almost to herself, she was always meant to sit there. The gallery felt it. The officers feared it. The judge knew it. The bench trembled not from the gavel, but from the truth standing before it. And everyone in that courtroom, for the first time, wondered if the real trial had only just begun. The gallery still stood, a wall of quiet defiance. No one shouted, no one rushed forward. They simply stood, and in their silence there was more power than the judge had ever commanded. The judge's robe seemed heavier now, clinging to him like guilt. He slammed the gavel again, but the sound no longer ruled the room. It was just wood on wood, hollow, fragile. The taller officer leaned across the bench, snarling, "You're losing them." "And this before she what?" the woman asked, her voice cutting through his panic. His lips twisted. "Before she tricks them into thinking she matters." Gasps rippled. The words hung, ugly and exposed, like an open wound. The woman tilted her head slightly, calm. "I do not need to trick anyone. My existence is not a trick. My worth is not a disguise." She stepped closer to the bench, her chains clinking softly. And then slowly, deliberately, she raised her wrists. The shackles, once tight, slipped loose. The chains fell to the floor with a dull, metallic thud. The sound echoed like a verdict. The officers froze. The judge's mouth opened, but no words came. From the gallery, a boy whispered, awestruck. She freed herself. The woman did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood taller, her eyes burning with a quiet fire. "I was never truly bound. Not by steel. Not by fear. Not by men who mistake cruelty for strength." The shorter officer's face twisted. She's dangerous," he shouted. "She's manipulating the whole room." But no one believed him now. The gallery only watched her. The woman in navy leaned forward, her lips trembling, eyes glistening with recognition. The judge finally found his voice, though it shook. "Who are you?" The woman's gaze fixed on him. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence was unbearable. Every heart in the courtroom raced, knowing something irreversible was about to break. Then she spoke. "I am not what you see shackled. I am not the story you wrote for me." "You asked who I am?" "Look closely." I have sat where you sit. I have held the gavel you cling to. I have worn the robe you disgrace. The judge's face drained of color. His hand trembled so violently the gavel slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. The gallery gasped as the truth began to sharpen. The taller officer shook his head furiously. Lies, all lies. He grabbed her arm roughly, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she locked eyes with him and spoke so softly that everyone still heard. Do you feel it? The floor trembling beneath your boots? That is not fear of me, it is fear of truth. You struck me in chains, and now the chains are gone. The officer pulled back as if burned. The woman turned, addressing the gallery, her voice carrying through every crack of the wood-paneled chamber. You thought justice was blind, but now it sees everything. And today it has chosen to open its eyes. The gallery stirred. Some wept. Others clapped a hand over their mouth, the weight of realization pressing down on them. The woman in navy whispered shakily, She is the judge. The judge stumbled back into his chair, pale as ash. This is impossible. You can't. This court belongs to me. The protagonist's calm reply cut through him like a blade. No, this court belongs to truth. And truth does not bow to arrogance. For the first time, the judge felt small on the bench. His robe was no shield. His gavel was no weapon. And his authority was unraveling thread by thread. The gallery leaned forward, waiting. The officers backed away, their arrogance cracking into raw fear, and the woman no longer prisoner, no longer victim stood at the edge of the bench, her next words heavy with promise. The seat you cling to was never truly yours. It was always mine. The room erupted not in chaos, but in gasps, tears, and stunned silence. The mask had cracked. The truth was here, and no one in that courtroom would ever see justice the same way. Again, the courtroom pulsed like a beating heart, every thud of silence louder than words, every eye burning into the men who once thought themselves untouchable. The judge leaned forward, sweat darkening his collar. This is my bench. This is my authority, he rasped, his voice breaking like cracked glass. The woman did not flinch. Authority without justice is theft, she replied. Her calmness cut deeper than any shout could have. The taller officer slammed a hand on the bench. She's lying. This whole thing is a trick. Arrest her again. But no one moved. The gallery didn't budge, and the bailiff, who once would have leapt without question, stood frozen, eyes wide. The shorter officer barked at him. Do your job, man. The bailiff's hands trembled. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, not this time. A murmur rippled through the gallery, spreading like fire across dry grass. Heads turned, whispers rose. Not this time. Not anymore. The judge slammed the bench with both fists, desperate. Order! I demand order! The woman's gaze pierced him. Order? She gestured to the crowd, her chains lying broken at her feet. This is order. Truth standing. Lies collapsing. Silence breaking. The gallery erupted into claps, stomps, voices rising not in chaos but in solidarity. The sound rattled the windows, shook the chandeliers, and drowned the judge's trembling voice. The judge's face blanched. He reached for his gavel, but it was gone, lying useless on the floor. The symbol of his power now looked like a child's toy. You can't take my seat, he whispered hoarsely, as though begging the universe itself. You can't undo what's been written. The woman took a step toward him, her presence towering even without the robe. I don't need to take your seat, she said. It was never truly yours. You wore it like a mask. And now the mask has fallen. The taller officer lunged, rage blinding him. Shut up, he shouted, raising his hand as if to strike her again. But before he could, a man from the gallery caught his arm mid-swing. Enough! the man bellowed. His grip was iron, his eyes blazing. Others rose behind him, voices sharp. Not again. No more. She's not alone. The officer yanked free, stumbling back. His arrogance had turned into desperation, his voice cracking like a child caught lying. The woman's eyes swept across the gallery. "You see?" she said softly. When truth stands, it does not stand alone. The shorter officer shoved his partner, hissing, "This is your fault. We should have ended this before she spoke." His mask of loyalty cracked into panic. They were no longer a united front, only broken men scrambling for footing. The judge sagged against the bench, his voice a whisper drowned in the storm. This court, the woman interrupted, her voice rising above the roar, has finally seen itself. It has seen its silence, its cruelty, its cowardice. And it will never forget. The gallery clapped, the sound swelling into thunder. Tears streamed down faces, tears of rage, of relief, of recognition. The woman in navy stepped forward now, her voice shaking but strong. She was always meant to be here. We all knew it deep down. We just refused to admit it. The judge buried his face in his hands. His robe clung to him like shame. He had no words left, no shield to hide behind. The woman stood tall, unshaken, her voice steady as stone. Justice does not beg for permission. It arrives when silence has failed. The final crack split the room not in sound, but in certainty. The gallery knew it. The officers felt it. The judge, broken on his own bench, finally understood. Silence had fallen. And with it, so had his reign. The echoes of defiance still hummed in the air. The gallery stood shoulder to shoulder, unyielding, while the judge sagged into his chair as though it were made of stone, pressing down on him. His robe, once a crown, now looked like a shroud. The woman's eyes swept across the room. No chains, no fear, only calm certainty. She stepped toward the bench, her every footfall a drumbeat of inevitability. The taller officer tried one last time, his voice hoarse. "You don't belong there. You can't erase us. You'll never erase the law." She turned to him, her tone measured. "I am not here to erase the law. I am here to remind it of its purpose." The officer staggered back, his fury finally broken into hollow defeat. His partner clung to the railing, eyes darting, searching for escape. But there was none. The gallery parted as she ascended the steps to the bench. The robe and gavel lay before her, symbols stripped of meaning until now. She paused, resting her hand lightly on the wood, and looked back at the people. "You stood when truth demanded it," she said. "You spoke when silence no longer protected you. That is justice, not the seat, not the robe, not the gavel. Justice is the courage to see and to speak." The room held its breath. She lifted the gavel from the floor, turning it slowly in her hand. No arrogance, no hunger, only gravity. Her voice deepened, steady as a verdict. But symbols still matter. And this one has been misused too long. With quiet finality, she struck the bench once. The sound rang not like hollow wood, but like thunder clearing the sky. The judge broke and slid from his chair. He muttered incoherently, his head bowed, his hands trembling. His reign had ended not in force, but in exposure. The woman set the gavel down and lowered herself into the judge's seat. She did not claim it with pride, but with duty, her back straight, her presence undeniable. The gallery erupted not in wild cheers, but in reverent silence, as though witnessing something sacred. Tears streaked faces, hands pressed to hearts. The woman in navy stepped forward, voice shaking. "Your Honor," she whispered, almost in awe. The title, once corrupted, felt whole again. The taller officer broke, his shout ragged. "This isn't real. You can't just—" But his words crumbled when the bailiff, once his ally, stepped forward. "Enough," the bailiff said firmly. The people have spoken. Justice has spoken. And so has she. The officers were led away not by force, but by the weight of their own collapse. Their arrogance, once towering, was nothing but rubble now. The woman, seated on the bench, let her gaze sweep across the room one last time. Her voice was calm, resolute. This seat was never about power. It was about truth. And today, truth has returned. The gavel rested in her hand. She struck it once more. Court is in session. The words carried through the chamber like a sunrise, breaking centuries of shadow. The gallery exhaled as one, a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Some wept, some smiled, all felt the weight lift. The judge's seat was no longer a throne of arrogance. It was a beacon of dignity, and the woman who had been struck in chains now sat as the living embodiment of justice itself. No one could ever take that image away.